Dr. Gupta is an author, co-author of several highly acclaimed books, as well as over 70 papers in leading academic journals. He serves as consultant, advisor, keynote speaker, board member, and chair on some of the world's largest corporations, including IBM, Indian Oil, and Huawei Technologies. Over the years, he has been a significant contribution to the platform, and once again, we're deeply delighted and honored to have him here with us. Please join me with a warm applause as we welcome Dr. Anil Gupta.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be here on this special day. Thank you very much, Pastor Paju, for inviting me again and for your warm hospitality. And hearty congratulations to Nigeria on the 59th anniversary as an independent nation. Nigeria has come a long way. It's been a stable democracy for many, many years now. It is Africa's largest economy. It is the number 6 in the world in terms of internet users, right behind China, India, US, Brazil, and Indonesia. All 5 of those economies have larger populations than Indonesia. Nigeria, and I have, of course, been coming to Nigeria now for many years. Plus, I've had students from Nigeria in my own business school. And so, the one thing that I have concluded about, through these interactions, that the fundamental DNA of a Nigerian is that of an entrepreneur. And so that's a phenomenal aspect of what we can say human capital or national capital. Other interesting and important observations that I have about Nigeria is in the most recent World Bank Ease of Doing Business rankings. The actual rankings will be coming out later in October, but they have already announced who are the top 20 improvers. And the top 20 improvers includes China, it includes India, but also very much it includes Nigeria. So congratulations again. And some of the areas that the World Bank has pointed out in terms of where Nigeria has shown the most improvement over the last 1 year, for example, new electronic platform for taxes and corporate affairs, for starting a business, for registering property, for getting construction permits, and so forth. And also, I'm delighted to note that Nigeria continues to march ahead. Some of the observations that I made is, for example, the official approval for the Bakassi deep sea port, the very recent, the central bank push to speed up the transition to a more cashless Nigeria, which is hugely important in many, many ways, including financial inclusion. Because when people, of course, financial inclusion has many things. But the one thing about cashless society is that you need to have some kind of an account, and all the transactions get recorded. So you're very much then you become part of the, let's say, the economic or the financial system of the country. Obviously, Nigeria is Africa's largest economy. So what happens in Nigeria, what Nigeria does? Number one, it is important in many ways, but one of the ways in which it's important is that it moves the needle for Africa. It is very difficult to move the needle for Africa without actually Nigeria moving its needle. So that's number one. Number two is that as the largest economy in Africa, Nigeria obviously is a role model. Just like China has been a role model in India. And just to give you an example of what I mean by Nigeria as a role model, again, looking at Asia, so Anand Mahindra is one of India's big industrialists, a billionaire, one of the world's richest people, highly respected, highly respected. So he's not just rich, but he is phenomenally respected for the professional way in which he runs his company, Mahindra Group. But what he made an observation a few years back about India, that for a country that invented yoga, India did not really start to stretch until China forced it to. So therefore, China acts as a role model, if you will, for other countries in Asia, certainly for India. Similarly, Nigeria serves as a role model for other countries in Africa. And obviously, talking of Africa, and this is an observation that some of you may remember if you were here at the May 1 event, the platform event, is that Africa is the world's oldest and the youngest continent. Obviously oldest because that's where humanity originated, and youngest because in terms of demographics, in terms of population, it is the youngest continent in the world. So with that, sort of looking at where Nigeria has been coming from and what the achievements that it has made, let me now look at the present and look ahead. So when I look at the present, obviously much work lies ahead. And I'll focus really on the economic dimension, because when we look at the economic dimension and say, what are the most important measures of the economic success of a society, before I pick GDP, I would look at per capita income. And I would look at, is per capita income moving ahead or not? Actually, I should put per capita income as number 2. Number 1, I would look at employment levels. And so employment levels and per capita income are the 2 most important measures of the economic health of a society. And both are important because one without the other actually is somewhat illusory. To detail a little more, that imagine a society where employment levels are actually high or unemployment is low, but per capita income is not going anywhere. That essentially means that one is distributing poverty, and which is not necessarily the best situation. On the other hand, one could imagine a situation where per capita incomes are rising, but unemployment levels are also very high. What that means is actually that inequality in the society is rising. And that again is neither morally, ethically acceptable, nor is it sustainable. So therefore really, and if we look at both of those measures, there is a lot that Nigeria needs to do. For example, the figures, according to several estimates, that in the 15 to 35 age group, the level of unemployment or underemployment in Nigeria is well higher than 25%. So that's clearly tells us something needs to be done. And again, of course, unemployment levels are important, not just that for people, but at the society level. High unemployment level runs the risk of feeding xenophobia. So if you look at the recent developments that took place in South Africa, for instance, against foreigners, especially foreigners from other African countries, including from Nigeria, is that one way to look at it, in my view, is to look at the high unemployment levels in South Africa among younger people. So high unemployment levels, therefore, are not acceptable either individually or socially at the level of society. Then if you look at per capita incomes, that since 2015, so we are looking at about now 5 years, 4 to 5 years, that since 2015, Nigeria's GDP growth rate, real GDP growth rate, has been slower than the growth rate of the population. So what that means is that per capita incomes in real terms in Nigeria have declined over the last 4 to 5 years. And obviously, if you look at the currency effects, then in terms of Nigeria's weight in the global economy, that has declined over the last 5 years. So that tells us that a lot needs to be done. A lot of the work lies ahead. And that sort of as a foundation for some of what I want to share with you, my thoughts. Now, of course, what are the underlying issues from my perspective as an outsider to Nigeria? The biggest underlying issue, I think, is that the economy is overly dependent on oil and gas. And I'm sure to everybody in the room, I'm not saying something that is somehow very profound or that you don't know deeply. And of course, that's being overly dependent on resources is a fundamental challenge for a society. And it's a challenge for society in both good times and not so good times. Good times meaning when commodity demand is rising, when commodity prices are rising. Those are good times. So obviously the country's GDP grows. However, that because commodities or resources, including oil and gas, don't generate a lot of employment, that the rise in GDP driven by commodities, for example, oil and gas, it doesn't necessarily fuel growth in employment. So what it does, yes, it brings the country resources, but also it exacerbates inequality. So therefore, and ultimately what's needed for a society to have sustainable economic growth is to create, boost the middle class. And that really requires boosting manufacturing, industry. And that's where, if you look at Nigeria, its manufacturing to GDP ratio, it's about 7.8 or 8%. And that is extremely low. So if I look at over dependence on oil and gas and massively under-dependent on manufacturing, that's really kind of the big issues. And just to put that 8% in perspective, so if you look at countries like China, countries like Vietnam, like Indonesia, their manufacturing to GDP growth rate is somewhere between 25 to 30%. Okay, so if you're talking about an emerging market that's boosting ahead, that's the kind of manufacturing contribution to GDP one needs to have. India, the country where my roots lie, even though I've been living now in the US for more than half my life, that India's manufacturing to GDP is about 17%. So that is, that's well higher than Nigeria's, but well below that of some of the other countries in Asia. And in India, the 17% is fundamentally viewed as far too low. So therefore, clearly 8% is something for Nigeria is far too low. So those are the big kind of issues. Diversification of the economy, if you will. So now, if we look ahead, and we say, okay, Nigeria today is 59, and then in 16 years, Nigeria will be 75. So if we were to say Nigeria in 75, and how do we create that Nigeria? That will be, even far more vibrant compared to the Nigeria of today. And if we are talking about a country that can grow at about 5% growth rate in real terms meaning net of inflation and everything, that in 15 years, 16 years, Nigeria's economy would be more than 2 times that of what it is now. And that's in real terms. In nominal terms, of course, it will be even, far bigger. And so how do we create? How does, one create? And there, ultimately, every society is a partnership. It's a partnership between the government, between large companies, between the medium, small enterprises, between the young professionals, and of course, society at large, NGOs. For example, the organization here. So I look at what are the things that, from my perspective, various actors, if you will, might actually need to do. Obviously, for the government, many things, but I pick, let's say, the single most important aspect, at least based on my analysis. And the single most important aspect, I would say, is electricity. Okay, and perhaps, of course, roads and highways, other segments of infrastructure are very important, but electricity, I would put even ahead of roads and highways, because electricity, if you look at the Industrial Revolution that made America and Europe rich, starting from the early 19th century, it was, that the lungs, which provide the power to the body. And it was steam engines first and then electricity next. And so without that power, the lungs of the economy, it's very difficult, impossible to march ahead. And if you look at in terms of the electricity that is produced in Nigeria, it is very inadequate, and obviously that's a segment of infrastructure where the government almost always has played a major role. In fact, there's a World Bank estimate that if Nigeria had continuous access to power, its economic growth rate each year could be 2% higher. Think about it, 2% is massive. Some estimates I was reading in Financial Times that the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria says that 40% of the cost of production goes to power. And if 40% of the cost of production is going to power, naturally, that is going to act as a constraint in terms of the development, the rise of manufacturing. If you look at Lagos, for instance, and look at the traffic and the number of vehicles on the road, it's obviously both crazy and impressive. But then you say, how many of these are manufactured in Nigeria versus imported? So that begins to raise some question marks. And one of the major factors will be, obviously, it's not that people don't know how to make cars or assemble cars. It's because the cost of power is way too high. Another, of course, on the, pick some of the big things that not just at the level of, say, the federal government, which plays a major role in, say, infrastructure, but at the level of state governments. Clearly, urban planning is a huge part. I was reading some figures that Lagos, for instance, and it is kind of, in some sense, shocking in terms of the scale of work that needs to be done. That Lagos is estimated to add 10 million more people by 2035. And obviously, if 10 million more people, if these estimates are valid, that requires massive urban planning in order to prevent other problems. Moving on to now corporates, that what can companies do, especially the larger companies. Obviously, Nigeria has, in the financial sector, many large banks. So that, in some sense we could say is quite healthy. Plus, of course, all the fintech revolution that is going on. But, and we have, the illustrious Mr. Dangote and Dangote Cement. But if you look at in the manufacturing sector, that if Mr. Dangote can create a powerhouse, a global powerhouse in that sector, what about other global powerhouses in other manufacturing industrial sectors, whether it is in automotive or in food processing and so on. So that's where people need to look at Mr. Dangote as a role model, if you will, and say, how can we replicate that story in other sectors of the economy? Also, large companies need to take leadership in terms of going green. Because they have the muscle and they make investments in manufacturing, they have large office buildings and so on, to think about how we can reduce our footprint, carbon footprint on Earth. Whether it is in terms of the factories and how we manage, what kind of processes we have, what kind of effluents, how do we manage the use of solar, use of wind, and so on. Perhaps even more important than that would be how to leverage the newly created African free trade area. And I think that's phenomenal for the continent. And why is it phenomenal for the continent? Because if you look at growth rate of economies around the world, these days, two of the fastest growing economies in the world are India and China. And there are several reasons why they are growing at a rapid rate. But one of the big factors is just the scale effect. Because what happens is that when you have a large economy, you just take two aspects of the large economy, and I take the case of India, is that when you have a large economy, then for multinationals, it makes sense to manufacture locally rather than to export to that economy. Because the large size of the economy creates the opportunity. Already, obviously, labor costs are low, other costs are possibly low, But the large scale creates the incentives, economic incentives, to say it just is logical to manufacture within India or manufacture within China rather than export to India or China. Also, both of these emerging markets, India and China, have a few extremely strong universities, colleges that are globally powerhouses. The Indian Institutes of Technology in India, or Tsinghua and Beida in China, Fudan, and so on. What happens is that when you have a large economy, then even though the overall quality of the education may still be weak, but because of the scale effect, it is possible to create 5, 10 world-class institutions. And so the scale matters. And so that's why, even though Nigeria is a large economy, large country, largest in Africa, Africa's scale is obviously much larger than that of Nigeria. And so what does it mean for companies? And I think for companies, what it means is that, so the government signs up and becomes part of the African Free Trade Area. But then who is going to be the actor? Who is going to leverage this new opportunity, this new African integration? It is not going to be the government. It is going to be companies. So what can companies do to think of themselves as not just Nigerian companies, but as African companies or continent-wide companies? How do you create, these continent-wide champions? It could be organic means, which means, you enter and you build up your presence in other markets, or it could be through joint ventures, or it can be through acquisitions. But clearly, companies need to take a role, because Nigeria's economy is ultimately a sum of the value added by all the economic actors, including companies. And if Nigerian companies become African continent-wide companies, they help leverage that scale effect for Nigeria. Another thing that the large companies need to do is to embrace digitization at full speed. And because this is the era, if we say, what's the single biggest development in the world today? Even more than perhaps than the rise of emerging markets, it would be the rise of technology, particularly the rise of digitization, which is affecting everything. What product people want to buy or service, or digitization of existing, cars, for example, are becoming computers on wheels. So therefore, digitization of everything, and who takes the lead in that? It has to be large companies. And of course, when large companies take the lead in digitization, because large companies become the central node in a hub where they have many other smaller companies that are suppliers to the large company. So there is a digitization of the large company will have a spillover effect on the digitization of the ecosystem as a whole. Another thing that large companies can do is, I'm thinking about the analogy of IKEA. IKEA being the Scandinavian global furniture powerhouse, right? The largest in the world. And IKEA, from the time that it was founded, of course, it doesn't manufacture anything itself. What IKEA does, it sources all the products from contract manufacturers. But the IKEA's philosophy from the very beginning has been that its goal is not just to buy from the contract manufacturers, but actually to build and upgrade on an ongoing basis the capabilities of the contract manufacturers. That the contract manufacturers are not just suppliers, but they are partners, and they are partners in a capability system. So therefore, large companies, it is important for them to say not just that I buy from A, B, and C, but how can I upgrade the capabilities of A, B, and C? And that's their contribution, if you will, to the upgrading of the whole medium-small enterprise segment of society. Large companies, naturally, they should play a role in launching accelerators where startups can be created, or at least, let's say, some of the impediments that get in the way of startups can be reduced by providing free or very low cost space, power, internet connections, and so forth. The one thing that if I look at, and again, what's happening in India, it has many multi-billion-dollar companies. global giants, many billionaires, and so on. And one of the things that very, very pleasing to me as somebody who comes from India, but it's something totally generalizable, is in CSR, corporate social responsibility. Some of the big players, what they have done is taken the lead in terms of, through their corporate foundations or personal foundations, taken the lead in education, especially education of young girls. And so therefore, again, that's an area where large companies can play a role in terms of, not just narrowly what they do in their business, but more broadly on society as a whole. Now, then I look at, okay, so, the young professionals, what could they do? What opportunities lie ahead for them to create the Nigeria that would be 75 years old and a much bigger powerhouse than it is today? And, and they're really for the young professionals, the single biggest area of opportunity is to look at digitization. And essentially, today's digital technologies are almost like God's gifts to create ventures that are actually successful, can be successful ventures by every, let's say, measure of capitalism. Yet at the same time, they solve major problems in society. And also, as I'll give several examples of the types of things that are happening, for instance, in Asia, that could be serve as role models, and some of those are already happening in Nigeria, as I understand. But obviously, the efforts can be multiplied many times over. But as people, so one thing I have noted about the creation of young ventures. And I spent a year as a visiting professor at Stanford, and I interacted a lot with Silicon Valley companies. I served on the board of a Silicon Valley company and so on. And when I look at that experience, and I look at what's happening in terms of young ventures created in India, is that obviously it's important to launch a venture. But then it's even more important to scale it up. And the young ventures that make a difference to society are companies that are started, but then they become big and not just remain small. So it's like the Google and the Facebook or WhatsApp or Uber or others that have Microsoft and so on. The ones that transform society are the ones that become big. So that any young professional who says, I'm going to become an entrepreneur in the digital era, should be thinking both about how do I go from level 0, which means nothing, to level 1. Okay, I have a venture on the ground that's now doing something, to then think about how do I go from level 1 to level 10. So with that as a background, so some examples. So I talked about education. If you look at what are some of the most important foundations for society's economic development, one is power, electricity, that I talked about. Another is education. And in the education area, again, if I look at India, yes, has some, very, very strong engineering institutions. But overall, the level of education system in India is still very weak. And if, I was to hold my breath and wait for the government to create schools and make sure that teachers actually show up, you would die before, that would ever happen. But what's happening, obviously, the government still needs to do its part. So we cannot say, we let the government off and focus only on young ventures. But then what's happening is that because of digitization, a number of ventures have been created that are roaringly successful, that are now beginning to solve major social problems without waiting for the government. So, for instance, there is a company, the biggest company in this space in India is Baiju. And Baiju is now actually one of the unicorns, companies that are valued more than $1 billion with global VCs, including from Silicon Valley and SoftBank from Japan and so on. And Baiju, it's pure online courses that you subscribe to. There's some, to some extent, you can get it free. Others you subscribe to. And, like classes all the way from, elementary level classes 1 to 3, or children at the level of 1 to 3, all the way to high school and beyond. And so for children ages 1 to 3, what they have done is done a deal with Disney, that using Disney stories, Disney characters, create actually online video courses for young children. And then, in various areas, whether it's about reading or about simple addition or simple arithmetic and so on. And then, of course, there are quizzes and tests and so on, etc. All of that acts, it can either act as a supplement to what happens in the school, or in the case where, in fact, there happens to be no school. That now, if you look at connectivity in terms of mobile and mobile broadband, that connectivity everywhere, including in Nigeria, is very rapidly becoming almost universal. And you look at the cost of devices, whether it's a smartphone or in fact a low-price tablet, the price is dropping to such an extent that everybody, no matter how poor a family is, they can afford it. So now if you have a very low-priced device and you have mobile broadband connectivity, all you need is content. And some of that content already exists. But content, like in India, it's being created in local languages. It's being created, some of that by companies such as Baiju. But a lot of other local content is being created by master teachers in local dialects, in local languages. And there are foundations, corporate foundations or personal foundations or global foundations like Gates and so on. They support, they finance this kind of way. So therefore, that's where actually really the role for, and again, Baiju is going all the way from class 1 to 3 and beyond. There's a company in China that is doing something similar, but instead of having actually master teachers develop courses, this is an AI-based, so that you have a device, low-end device, you have, of course, mobile broadband connectivity, and then, you go to the website and then say you want to learn math. So, and it's actually an AI system that's feeding you problems based on where that individual child is. So that's an opportunity. But then, look at other areas of education. So there is a company in India called TeamLease. And TeamLease is the largest player, again, a startup, but not too small anymore, is to train skilled workers. So it's like carpenters and electricians and plumbers, to take people who are unskilled and make them skilled workers. Where actually, clearly, does industry need people like that? Yes. And the payment for that is made by the employers. So therefore, for the individual who is being trained in these skills, it's not a zero cost, because you need to have some skin in the game. Otherwise, you don't kind of take it seriously. But ultimately, the cost is low for the individual, and the rest is paid by the employer. So, another example of what we can say, that there is a market failure. Companies need skilled workers. People are willing to become skilled workers, but the two are not connected. And a venture gets created to solve that particular problem. Take another area where young professionals can create ventures to solve major social problems. Take healthcare. Now, in healthcare, there are many aspects of healthcare that needs to be fixed in every society. But one of the aspects that needs to be fixed in most emerging markets, emerging economies, is the having trained doctors and trained nurses. Now, obviously, if we are talking about trained as in degrees in medicine and degrees in nursing and so on, that takes time, and it takes time to scale that up. But then, if you look at, for instance, China or India, take China, even under Mao, they created these barefoot doctors. And so barefoot doctors clearly are not the same as somebody with an MD degree. But, there's kind of, we don't have to think of healthcare professionals as in binary terms. Either you have a professional degree or you are nothing. But how about something in between? And just take nurses, for instance. So there are ventures being created where purely through online mechanisms, one can get certified as a nurse practitioner. It's not the same thing as a degree, but it's certainly halfway there. And now, and who can create this kind of just like teaching children or converting unskilled into skilled workers? How about converting people who are interested into becoming now actually, quote unquote, nurse practitioners? And then they can be connected through apps or through Uber-like peer-to-peer connections to individuals who need healthcare advice. And so, another area in education where young professionals can create companies is ventures is how about, teaching people software. Because, if the whole economy is going to become digital, which, there is really no doubt that it is happening, the demand for software professionals, as far as I understand from talking to people, whether it's in Silicon Valley or in the computer science department at my university, is that the demand for, kind of foreseeable future for software professionals, whether it's in the US or in India or in China, and I suspect the same for Nigeria, will continue to exceed the supply of software professionals. So therefore, and how does that training take place? I mean, India's whole IT revolution was not driven by, the IITs, the Indian Institutes of Technology that train software engineers. The whole IT revolution in India was driven by young ventures that came into being that would offer 1 year or 2 year programs, and that would therefore offer certificates, not degrees, in this type of programming or that type of programming. Okay, and so therefore, and that's again, who plays that kind of role? It's not the universities, but it's actually young ventures created, educational ventures created by professionals. Then, other areas, social problems where young ventures can play a huge role is take healthcare. So again, I talked about how one can train nurse practitioners using technology in the education domain. There's a company in India, it's now very successful, it's no longer, it's a startup, but still now it's a startup that has proved itself to be very successful and is growing rapidly, called Practo. And what Practo does is that it really, you can think of it almost like an Uber model for healthcare. So they have various professionals that are part of their network, which includes nurses, which includes physical therapy specialists, which include doctors, which include dentists, and so on, etc. And then, of course, you have customers, and you can sign up for various kind of levels of programs or services, and there are different levels of pricing, etc., where you can get, advice from a professional through online chat. You can get advice from a professional through a voice consultation. Or you can use Practo to set up an actual in-person appointment. Practo also has an online pharmacy, so the professional then says, okay, you need XYZ medicine. Well, they have an online pharmacy, so it gets delivered to your home. And what we are really doing is eliminating friction, all right? Eliminating scarcity. And that is, so eliminating scarcity and friction, whether it's in education or in healthcare, those are really the major economic and social challenges where actually digital technologies are now being used by people to create, by young professionals to create companies. There are roaringly successful self-help apps in India. So, of course, the overall level of, adult literacy in India is still quite low. Quite low, meaning it's about 75%, but that's, again, if you look at the distribution across males versus females, literacy among females, among women is still actually pitifully low. And so, and how do they get, help? Say somebody is pregnant, okay? So therefore, how do I, what do I eat? How do I manage myself, okay? So in local languages, there are now apps that the person can go to. Of course, you've got to market those apps and so on, where the person can figure out, get advice. Now you have a baby who is being born. How do I take care of the child? So again, there are apps. And those apps can provide advice from a server, or it can become a network, and where there are more experienced mothers from the same community who can now provide advice in the local language to another person within the same network. Of course, there is remote diagnostics. Through the mobile phone, is now becoming smarter and smarter and smarter and smarter. Where, in fact, very recently, somewhere in the last couple of months, I don't yet know the details of it, but Google announced that they have, created through the smartphone cameras by looking into the eyes and then sending it to a server to be able to detect diabetes. Okay, and so obviously that kind of a technology and that kind of an app would be extremely expensive, almost free. And so can ventures be created to take these technologies being developed and bridge? Here is technology, here is the user in Nigeria. How can we bridge the two? So then again, of course, take another area. I have been talking about Uber. Obviously, that's an area of personal transportation. And so you have, there's a company in Nigeria created O-Ride, which is for personal transportation using motorbikes rather than cars. But the sharing economy, the same Uber model, if you will, or Airbnb model, is now getting implemented in trucking. So you have trucks which have extra capacity or idle capacity, and then you have somebody who needs trucking service. You have warehouses. Somebody has excess space in a warehouse, and somebody else needs space in the warehouse. So you can create another venture. Ambulances. Do we rely on the state, or actually can we create an Uber-like venture that can bring ambulance service on demand? Blood donation. There are so many people who need blood and so many people who are willing to actually donate blood. How do we connect the two? How about the delivery of medicine to remote areas? How do we bridge that? Can we use drones to solve that problem? There are ventures being created in many, many countries, including the US and China and India, about farm machinery. So you have farm machinery that sits idle many times, and then you have people who don't have farm machinery. Can we bridge the two? And essentially, there's so one of my friends in India, or actually the son of a friend in India, he's created a very successful venture, and which is very interesting. I haven't seen that anywhere. And the venture is actually the students in the last year of college. So as they are, 1 year away from embarking into the real world, they need coaching, they need advice, and they need advice not in terms of the subjects, because they are learning those in the college, but they need advice about how to think about their career, okay? Career management. So that's on one side. And on the other side, they have actually people who might be 25 years old, 30 years old, 35 years old, who are working in companies. They are professionals, but they have some time on their hands, maybe in the evenings or weekends, and they are willing to devote that time to be a mentor, a coach to this student who is in the last year of college, whether in engineering or business or other fields. And again, this is not for charity in this particular company's case. The students pay a fee. Perhaps the college agrees to pay a fee as a way to boost employment for its graduates and future success of its graduates, and the more mid-senior level professionals who devote their time, they get paid for their time. So it's a venture, which is again bridging that demand and supply that historically is not being bridged. Agriculture, and so of course, as you know very well, there are issues about Nigeria and its dependence on foreign food supplies. And what issues, what problems it creates, and what should be the government policy in that regard. But naturally, it would be whether one agrees or disagrees with various aspects of the government's policy, it would be hard to disagree with the point that agricultural productivity, it would be good for the country. It would be good for China, it would be good for India, it would be good for Nigeria to boost agricultural productivity. And in boosting agricultural productivity, for instance, there is a venture in India, now it's about 8 years old, still a young venture, but young as in, still, already multi-million-dollar successful venture called Crop In. And Cropin has global investors, including from Silicon Valley. Gates Foundation has its own venture fund, which invests not for charity purposes, but actually to make money. So that fund from the Gates Foundation is also an investor, put in a few $1 million into this venture. And what Cropin does, it says, okay, so now you are the farmer. You could be a small farmer or a big farmer. You have a mobile phone. You register on our network, and it's not for free. But the prices are, essentially the price that the farmer pays versus the value that the farmer derives. The value is so much larger than the price to the farmer that the farmer has no problems signing on. So you sign on as a member. And what you do, on a regular basis, you take pictures of your crop, of the leaves of the crop, and you upload it to the system. And the system now, Cropin system, they have real-time data in terms of weather. They have machine learning at the back end. They have, of course, satellite imagery to look at what's happening, not at that particular farm necessarily only, but also in that particular region. And they combine all of that to feed back to the farmer about what to do, about what kind of disease you probably have, what should you do about it, for instance. Also, so they give ongoing micro level, as best as possible, 7-day weather forecasts, which is regularly updated. They give to the farmer advice on what to plant season by season. Or can you plant 2 different crops on the same land at the same time? How do you monitor crop health? How do you estimate what the harvest is likely to be? Advice regarding pest management, and so on. And all of that information, of course, that's given back to the farmer. But then for a whole collection of farmers, that information in the form of a dashboard goes to the local government officials or agriculture management officials, so they can figure out from a more kind of a wider policy planning purposes what they needs to do. And again, if this kind of an approach, at least what the figures are, that the productivity of each farm, even the smallest farms, goes up somewhere between 25 to 50%. That's huge. That's huge. So that's again, in the area of agriculture. And finally, if you look at infrastructure, take electricity. Going back to electricity that I started out, is that now the cost of solar has become so low that on a total cost basis, the cost of solar is now lower than the cost of traditional thermal power. And it's, thermal power is not becoming cheaper by the day, but solar power is becoming, continues to become cheaper by the day. So therefore, can young ventures be created? Already in many economies, such ventures exist, to, rooftop mini solar for homes or mini grids for villages. And so you also have, in addition to the solar panels, you have a battery storage. And that battery storage is connected through the internet, mobile internet, to the company that is providing this kind of a service. And essentially, through the app on the smartphone, the person in the house, if they need power, okay, they could sign on to a deal that they have continuous power. Or they could sign on to a deal almost just like ordering a taxi or ordering an Uber. Okay, I need power now. And the battery, which is disconnected from use, gets turned on, gets connected, and you are charged, let's say, for the 1 hour of power that you need, and so on. So these are examples of how, even in the area of electricity, like infrastructure, where young ventures are beginning to play a role. So, with that, I will close my own talks and, sharing of my own ideas, and perhaps we have some time to for a Q&A, Pastor, would that, yes? Okay, so just to summarize, I think Nigeria has come a long way, but with, this concerted action, collaborative action by the government, by large companies, by medium, small enterprises, by young professionals, by, civil society at large, I think Nigeria at 75 years of age from now could be, should be, at least 2 times in real terms, net of inflation, of what it is now, but actually, potentially why 2 times, 1 or 3 times. And think about how different Nigeria will be if its per capita income, which is about $2,000 today, per capita income, net of inflation in real terms, was not 2,000 but 4,000 for the whole country, for 200 million people or more, or if it was 5,000. So that's the kind of potential where everybody in society needs to collaborate and contribute. So with that, thank you very much.